Hello, class, and welcome to week 4 of CIS 112, Operating Systems Beginning Linux. So, overview for this week. Let's see. So, we'll be covering user and group management commands. We'll learn how to modify, create users, all from the command line. So, you can do this in like your GUI systems, right? So, for example, when you log into your Windows, right, you type in your password. Sometimes you might have different users, right, on the computer. Well, all of that can be executed very, very quickly in the command line. So while GUIs do offer, easy account management, CLI is definitely faster, and it's going to be more flexible when you're a system administrator, especially in a Linux operating system. So we'll also explore sudo. So I know some of you have already been using sudo in some of your assignments. Now, the way I designed those assignments, you didn't really need sudo, but I know sometimes the way we set up our VMs, uh, executing those commands didn't work unless we put sudo in front. So we'll talk about in the demo, especially how to make yourself a sudo user, and in the slides, we'll talk about what it means to be a sudo user. All right, so for today's lesson, let's do a little bit of review. Remember, command flags are when you add some extra options for your command. So usually after the command. So for example, this read command when you want to read a directory and list all the files in it. You do ls, but if you add a dash l, it'll give you extra information. A dash a, it'll show even the hidden files. Remember, make directory is for making directories. RMDIR. I saw a lot of you try to use RMDIR for lab number 3. Remember, RMDIR is very limited. It doesn't really work that great because it only works on a directory that's empty. Most of the times, a directory has files or other directories in it. That's when you have to use your remove. Um, and typically, if you want to delete everything inside, you got to do recursive, so dash R. My favorite to use is rm-rf, just to wipe it out completely without it asking me for confirmation. Yeah, so remember, if you want to delete a directory, you're really going to use your rm command. And usually I like to use dash rf. Touch is a write command. We'll talk about read and write today. Touch is one of your write commands. Nano, that's another write command. Cat, that's a read command. MV and CP, those are going to be write commands. All right, so let's see. Users in Linux. So if we're going to talk about user management, we need to talk about what a user is. A user is anybody that is an entity in the system that can process, run files, and is associated with a username or home directory. It's just like a user, right, in a regular computer. It's someone who can run applications, can save files, can use the computer, can use the system. So user is someone who is using the system. So there are 3 types of users. There are regular users, there are system users, and there are root users. So regular users are accounts with restricted access. They can't do everything they want. We can define those that access or those permissions via user and group management commands that we'll cover today. There are system users, so accounts created by the OS for running services. So sometimes it'll create special accounts just for the background processes. So things that the operating system needs to run. So typically not your traditional user. Um, and then we have root user. So root user is the highest level of user. Every user actually has an ID. Root users by default have the ID of 0, so they're the first, the number one, the original user. So they can do anything they want on the operating system. So with great power, great responsibility, right? A little Spider-Man quote for you. You can do anything as root user, which means you can also do destructive things, right? You can eliminate users and groups with just a few commands. You can delete files. That could be system files. That could be user files. So you could essentially even crash the system, right, if you run the wrong commands as a root user. So typically we don't like to give people access to the root user unless we really, really have to. As we'll see, there is a alternative way to give people higher privileges, to give them root user privileges, and that's going to be through sudo. We'll talk about that in a sec. So if we're going to talk about users, we have to talk about groups. So groups is just a collection of users. When you define a group, it's easier for you to manage permissions without having to go one user at a time. Let's say you have 100 users, right? If you create a group for all 100 users, you can set the permissions on the group and then set the permissions by extension on those 100 users if they're a part of the group. So rather than going through each user and running a command for each one, you can just run one command to assign them to a group and then one to set the permissions for the group. So groups is an even faster way of managing permissions by grouping users together. So it definitely simplifies your control of those users. So primary groups, it's the group that the system assigns to files that a user creates. Each user usually belongs to a primary group, so when you create a user, you usually have a group of the same name. So for example, VBox user, there's already a group called VBox user, same name as the user. They don't always have to be the same name, they can definitely be different. But by default, they usually have the same name. There's also supplemental groups, which we'll cover in the demo. You can create additional groups, and then by extension, right, give those groups special permissions. One of the most useful groups is the sudo group. So when you add users to this very special group, you're plugging them in to the root user privileges. So you're not giving them the password to run as root, but you're giving them kind of like a plugin, a little bridge into root user privileges. So you're giving them access to special privileges. And you can actually limit, right? You can say, hey, root user privileges, but without certain permissions, right? You can eliminate permissions for the sudo group. So sudo group is actually the way that we get around, right? Not giving users direct root access. We actually give them this layer of protection by giving them sudo access instead of root. So sudo is a command that allows a permitted user to execute a command as the super user or a root user of the system. So with sudo, you can control other people's files. You'll basically be running as root. So it does give you elevated privileges for performing administrative tasks. So for example, if you want to update packages for the system, apt update is the command for that. We'll cover that in the following weeks. You usually need sudo in front because you're modifying the system when you install a package. Installing packages is like installing a program, like a video game, right? Or, you know, if you're installing Microsoft Word, for example. Again, we'll cover that in the following weeks. But yeah, if you're changing the system, you probably need sudo. Well, if you're adding users and groups, you're changing the system. So that means when we're running all the commands for this week, you're probably going to have sudo in front of it. So how do we control who is a sudoer? Well, it's controlled through the etc sudoers file. So that sudoers file, you can edit it. There are other ways to add people to the sudo group, as we'll see with some of the commands. But if you go in and do edit that file, you can add additional users to the sudo group. So yeah, all the sudoer information is stored in that etc sudoers file. Etc is one of those special directories in Linux. Remember that video, right? That discussion we had where you had to go through and learn through the different special directories in Linux. Etc is one of them, and sudoers file is inside that directory. You can watch that video, right, for more information on those special directories. We're actually going to use one for today's lab, the SRV directory. All right, so once you put somebody as in the sudoer file, they're going to have full root access. It's important to limit who has sudo access, right? Because if they have sudo access, they have root privileges. And if they have root privileges, that could be a security risk, right, for the system. Security in terms of their access to files, and security in the sense of the stability of the system. What if they run the wrong command, delete the wrong file, and boom, the Linux system crashes? That would be terrible, right, in a business professional environment. All right, so root versus sudo, what are the difference? Well, root means you have direct access to the system. Once you type in that password to get into root, which we'll do today actually in the demo, you can do whatever you want. Sudo, however, so instead of giving someone the password for root, you can add them to the sudo group. So now you're controlling, right, who's part of the system versus making the password for root public, right? Let's say you send everybody in the company, oh, here's the root password. Do whatever you want. Now you don't know who's running the commands, right? It's going to look like if everybody's root, right? It's not going to actually tell you Alice was running on root. It's just going to say root ran this command. Versus when you're running as sudo, you still have information of who ran those commands. So sudo is safer because you get root privileges without actually running as root. In addition to the security of running as sudo, when you do run sudo commands, they are logged into the security logs of Linux, of the shell logs. When you run as root, though, there is no logging, so they're not keeping track of you when you're running as root. So if you do something bad, it's hard to go back and check who was the person who ran those commands if you're running as root. So that's kind of what the bottom emphasizes, right? Sudo reduces the risk of system-wide errors by limiting who can run those commands. So sudo, remember, it's that extra layer. Sure, you're plugging in as root, but as another sudo user, right, or as a root user, I can control who has sudo. If I give you the password for root, I can no longer control, right, add you or remove you as a root user. Sudo, I can add you to the sudo group, I can remove you whenever I want, and I can even limit how many of those root privileges you have. We'll show you the command on how to see those privileges in the demo. Alright, so how do you add yourself to the sudoers? Well, first you want to see what is your username. You can run the whoami. So this command will display your current username. You'll need it for step 3. Then you're going to log in as the root user by doing su-. That's the beginning of the login command. Typically you put a username after that. If you don't put a username, it's going to log you in as the root user. We'll see that in the next slides, that su- command. Once you're logged in as the root user, you're going to do sudo usermod ag. We're going to talk about what these flags mean in a sec. But yeah, that's how you're going to add yourself to the sudoers. And then make sure to put the username that you got from whoami. For most of us, it should be vboxuser, but if you changed it during the setup process, then it might be a different username. So yeah, this command will add your username to the sudo group. Notice we had to put the name of the group here. We'll talk about that syntax in the next slides. Alright, permissions. So one of the things you do after creating groups, after creating users, is giving permissions to those users and groups. What can they do on a file or a directory? What are they allowed to do? Well, there's 3 main categories of permissions. There's read. Read means you can view a file. That could be your ls command, right? That could be your cat command. Those are 2 commands that allow you to view files or directories. Then there's your write. That's going to be your touch commands, right? Your nano commands. Write commands are when you modify or delete the contents of a file or directory. That could also be remove, right? That would technically be a write command since you're modifying the directory. You're removing a file from the directory. And then there's execute, so that's the ability to execute or run a program. We'll be talking about more about scripts and programs in Linux in the following weeks. But just know when you run a program, just like when you run Microsoft Word, when you run Photoshop, right? Whatever app you're running, technically you're executing the app. So we'll talk about what that looks like in Linux in the following weeks. Permission levels. So yeah, we have different levels of access, but we also have different levels of owners. So this is permission. So these are access permissions. Access permissions / privileges. And these are permission levels. So user permission levels. So like what are the different levels of permissions for the different types of users? Well, first we need to know what those levels are, right? We can see what are the access permissions, like what can they actually do? Access rights, we'll change that to rights permissions. And then we have the permission levels. So once you've defined, right, in fact, we're going to put this slide first because it's going to make more sense if we cover this first. Permission levels there's 3 main types. So there's the owner of the file. So for example, VBox user, you have your home directory. For the first assignments, you made some files, you made some directories. By default, your home directory and all the files in it, you're the owner. VBox user is the owner. By default, it does also create a group called VBox user that has all the same permissions, right, as the owner. But with groups, right, you can create extra groups, which we'll be doing in the demo and in the lab. And in that group, right, you can define different permissions. So maybe the group doesn't have all the permissions that the owner has. Typically, you'll give the owner the most permissions, full control over the file, and then groups you'll start limiting stuff. Maybe they can't delete or add files. That's going to be write permissions. Maybe they can't read at all. Sorry, excuse me. Maybe they can't read any of the files, so they can't ls or cat any files. Then that's going to be they're going to be limited in their read permissions. And then we have the X for execute. We'll talk about how to assign those in a sec. And then outside the group, so if you're not an owner and if you're not in a group for that directory, then you're part of the others group. So that's everybody else. By default, you usually don't have any permissions. Sometimes you'll have read only, where you can just read the files, so ls and cat them. But sometimes you won't even be able to do that. So that's the others group. So owner is person who owns the file. Group is a set of users who might have limited permissions on the file. And then others is anybody who's not an owner and who's not part of a group assigned to that file. All right. So remember, what are the types of permissions that you can give to owner, group, or other user? It's going to be the read, write, execute. Can they view the file? Or can they list a directory's contents? The ls command, right? View might be the cat. Write, can they write to the file? Can they remove, delete, right? So that's rm or rmdir. Modify, that's going to be your nanos. Or create. Let's add create here, actually. Create, modify, or delete. That's going to be, create's going to be your touch command, for example, right? Or your mkdir if you're creating a directory. And then execute, again, we'll cover that more in the following weeks. All right, so how do we actually change permissions? Now, we'll take a deeper dive right into the chmod command. But there's something we need to know about the chmod command before we get to it. Is the different permission levels. Remember, there's owner, group, and others. So, if we're going to, for example, set permissions for a particular file, we need to set the owner, group, and others permission using these digits. And each digit corresponds to a different level of access. All right, so for example, if I have a chmod 755, that's the first number goes for the owner. So first number is owner. Next one is group, G for group. Let's do owner, group, and then other, OTH. So whenever you add these numbers to the chmod flag, we'll talk about the chmod flag a little bit more in depth. We're just going to focus on the numbers. The 7 is the first number here, so that goes to the owner. What does 7 mean? 7 means read, write, execute. That's the highest level. You can do all three. You're not limited at all. Now, the second number in the sequence belongs to the group. So what are the permissions for the group? Well, for this example, we have a 5 in the 755. So the 5 means you can read the files and you can execute programs. Notice you cannot write. We have a dash in the middle for write. So that's how we use, that's how we translate the 7.5. The 5 means that you can't particularly write to this directory. So that's why we leave the write empty here. So the 5 is r-x. This is r-w-x. And then for others, they set it to 5. So this would also be r-x. That means everybody else has the same permissions as a group owner. All right, so let's do a little exercise. Let's throw some different numbers at you and see if you can identify what they mean. Remember, first number is owner, second number is group, third number is other. Let's go 700. What does that mean? It means my owner has a 7, and 7 means they can do everything. So my owner has all the privileges. My group now has a 0 because that's the second digit. That's for group. That means they can't do anything. They have no permissions on those files. And then others have also a 0, so that means they also can't do anything on those files. All right, let's go a little bit backwards. What if I want to give my owner all the permissions and give my group all the permissions and others no permissions? Well, to give my owner all permissions, that's the first number. I'm going to give them a 7. If I want my group to also have all the permissions, I'm also going to give them a 7. And if I want my others to have no permissions, I'm going to give them a 0. All right, again, we're going to go a little bit backwards. I want my owner to have RWX. That means all the permissions. I want my group to have also, actually no, I'm going to limit my group a little bit. I'm going to say they can only read. So read, but not write and not execute. And then for others, they're going to have no permissions. All right, so read, write, execute. We should probably already have the kind of the hang of that one. That's a 7. That's the highest level. Let's look up the R dash dash. That means they can only read, they can't write, and they can't execute. That's going to be a 4. Read only. That means that's all they can do is read only. So that's going to be a 4. And if they have no permissions, that's a 0. So hopefully that kind of gets your feet wet, right, with the different numbers on Chmod and how they correspond to different permissions. We'll actually see in the demo, right, how this affects the commands you can run. Because remember, different commands for different levels. ls, for example, is a read command. Cat is a read command. Again, touch is a write command. rm is a write command because you're deleting. And then nano is also a write command because you're modifying the file. All right, let's get into our bash shell. So let's do the actual commands. So chmod, what is chmod for? We already went over it. It's a command in Linux used to change the permissions of a file. So these are access rights of a file or directory. Remember, access rights is read, write, execute. So the syntax is chmod, the permissions, right, that you want to give it. Remember, the first number is owner, second number is group, third number is others. And then, of course, you have to give it a file or a directory. So in this example, they do chmod 755 example.txt. This command gives permissions of example.txt to rwx and then r-x, r-x. What does that mean? That means the owner has all the permissions, a 7, while restricting others to read and execute. 5.5 means read and execute. That means groups. We're gonna be extra specific. We're restricting groups and other users. Group users and other users. Just to be very, very precise, right? Know that there's 2 other numbers, 2 5s. So group numbers is the first 5. The second 5 is for the others. So they can only read and execute because we gave them a 5. Remember, if we go back to the slide, 5 is read and execute. Means they can't write. Alright, so chmod permissions guide. Here's a guide on them. The different sequences: 777, 755, 750, 700, 666, different ones. Yeah, just to give you an idea, right? But honestly, this slide is probably the more useful. Alright, so chown. Chown command in Linux is to change the ownership of files. So, sure, you can modify, right, the group, but maybe you still have to tell Linux system, hey, I want this group to be owner of this file. So in order to do that, you got to use the chown command. So you're going to do chown. That's going to be the user, and then the group user/owner, right? The group that they belong to, and then the file directory that you want to change ownership for. So for example, sudo, notice now we're putting sudo in front of stuff, right? In fact, our chmod should have had sudo. just for safekeeping. Remember, if you're working with your own home directory, you don't need sudo. But for the most part, in most situations, you're going to need sudo running these commands because we're modifying users, groups, ownership. All right, so syntax should be sudo chown user slash owner, the group file directory. So for example, sudo chown user1 group1 example.txt. And let's change this. Let's do student class just to give you some actual, concrete names. So this is going to change the owner of example.txt to student. Student is now the owner, and the group to group1. In this case, we called it class, right? You can always leave the group empty. Or sorry, the user empty. If you leave user empty, it will only set the group permission. Or let's say ownership. So for example, if you do chown and then class. And notice I didn't actually put so yeah, if you leave user field empty, it will only set group ownership. So I chown class, we left the user empty, so it's just going to set the group ownership to class. So you don't always have to provide a user. So options flags, let's see the next slide for some options flags. So R, you're definitely going to want to use R almost every single time because it's going to change the ownership of all the files and directories inside that directory. So if you want all the children of that folder to also have those new ownership rules, you got to give it a -R. So for the most part, you got to go with your sudo chown -R. Very few situations where you're probably not going to want to use -R. It's only like if you want the top level to have a certain permission and maybe not the lower levels. Notice the colon separates the owner and group names. Again, you can leave the owner empty if you want. Owner is optional. As we saw in the previous slide, you could do R -- reference, so you can change the ownership to match that of a specified file. So let's say you already set the ownership for a different folder or a different file. You can just copy those rules over by using the reference flag. So you tell the one that you want to copy from and then copy to. So it sets the ownership of example.txt to match ref.txt. I'm going to italicize that. There you go. So yeah, that's the chown flag. Some chown command with some useful flags. Let's go on to user mod. User mods, you want to modify a user. Usually if you want to change the properties, often used for changing the groups that a user belongs to. So very useful for this week. So it's usually user mod, option, and then some arguments. Let's look at this example of sudo user mod -l student. So this command will lock the user account names student. So you won't be able to change those account names essentially for student. A more useful one though is AG. User mod AG, and then let's call it sudo. This command will add the student, the user named student, to the group named sudo without modifying its previous group assignments. So this is a very popular one. We do use it. For example, you can run user sudo mod. Sudo mod. Oh my gosh. Okay, you can run sudo user mod AG sudo student. That's definitely possible to do. Notice sudo twice. That's because sudo here is the name of the group, the sudoers group. So this is probably the most popular use of user mod, is when you're adding a user to a particular group. We'll look at those flags in the next slide. So some different flags here. We have the -m if you want to move the home directory. The longer one is -- move home. You just provide the directory you want to move it to. We have the login if you want to change the user's login name. Unlock if you want to lock a user's password. Sorry, -u is to unlock a user's password if it's already locked, and -l is to lock a user's password. So that's essentially if you want to, lock the account and not have them be able to log in. There are more flags to explore. You can definitely explore them here, but the most popular ones are going to be your -ag. A is to add the user to a supplementary group, and then the G is a list of supplementary groups which the user is also a member of. So when you add the G, it's going to keep them in all the same groups. So -ag is the most popular one. Not going to add it to the options flags here. I'm just going to make a note here for y'all. -ag is one of the most useful flags for user one. Alright, so add user. This is actually kind of a shortcut command for a different command called user add. Add user, somebody created this because they found that user add was kind of limited. You would have to run a bunch of user add commands just to add a new user account. So they kind of put all those commands together in something called the add user command. So it's not by default. It doesn't come in pre-installed to a lot of Linux systems. For Ubuntu, it is automatically installed. It should be in your Ubuntu. But if you do get, a command failed or invalid command, you can just do a sudo apt install add user, and that'll fix those errors. It'll add this package, add user. So just like you can install, software, Photoshop, Microsoft Word, all different kinds of, video game is a software. Just like you can install software onto your computer, onto your operating system, you can also install command line packages into your Linux shell. So we'll cover that in the next few weeks. But yeah, if you get errors on your add user, just run this command. If you're on a Fedora system, it's going to be slightly different. It's going to be sudo dnf install. Remember, you can always use ChatGPT. That's chatgpt.com for extra help on any command. So you could say, for example, how to install add user onto my Linux machine. It's going to tell you, add user. For Ubuntu, sudo apt install password, so it's included in the password package. It's also included in the add utils or shadow utils. You could also just do sudo apt install add user. That should also work. Yeah, we can even verify. Does sudo apt install add user work? Yeah, you can add it separately, or you can install it as part of the passwd package. Either one should work. Now, if you're in a Fedora, notice it's dnf install. If you're in a CentOS or RHEL, that's going to be a yum install. Arch Linux, that's sudo pacman --shadow. But again, we all installed an Ubuntu machine, so it should just be sudo apt install or sudo apt update before you run the sudo apt install. Again, though, if you did the setup just like I did, you shouldn't have to run this command at all. Yeah, so don't worry about it until you get errors. Alright, so add user command. So it's used to add a new user to your current Linux machine. It's sudo add user. Remember sudo because we're doing modifications to the users and groups in the Linux system. And then you give it an option and an argument. Don't always have to give an option, right? You don't have to add option flags. So in the example of sudo add user student, we'll add a user named student to the system. Let's fix that typo. So some options flags. You have home, so you can specify the home directory when you're creating the new user. You can also give it different shells. So There are different types of shells that you can use. So by default, we use the bin bash shell. There's also the ZSH shell. There's different shells that you can use. There's node shells for, you know, all different situations. You're probably not going to use these flags right at all, but just to give you an example of some flags that are available on the ad user. All right, so let's move forward. Here's some extra flags. We already covered the home. System is if you want to create a system level account. Disabled password if you want to change the user's login name. Geckos to provide additional information about the user, such as full name, room number, home phone. This is actually all included in the, I'll just say add user. And you know what? I don't want to overwhelm y'all with information, so I'm just going to delete this one entirely. Yeah, those flags are more than enough that you need. Alright, so let's see. Logging in as another user. So once you do create another user, you can certainly just, close your VM, log out of VM through the GUI. You could also do it through the command line. SU dash and whatever the username is. We do it in the demo, we do it in the lab. Actually, I don't think we do it in the demo, but we do it in the lab video if you're curious on what that looks like when you run it. But yeah, SU dash and then the username will log you into that user. So for example, SU-student will log you into the user account named student. Usually after you hit this command, it'll ask you for a password. When typing in passwords to the command line, they're hidden. So you're going to be typing, nothing's going to be showing up. That's normal. That's because they're hiding the password. They're trying to give that extra level of security, right? So don't let it confuse you and think that your keyboard's not working. This is just what happens when you're typing in passwords into the command line. All right, so second to last command. I guess technically we have two more. So almost there in the last commands, we have group add. So group add commands adds a new group to the system. So remember, if you want to manage multiple users at once, you're going to want to create a group for them. So group add is going to create new groups. So sudo group app Linux class, for example, creates a new group called Linux class to the system. If you wanted to add that user to the Linux class, so for example, VBox user to Linux class, you go to your user mod, AG, and then it'd be Linux class, VBox user. So this command right here would add VBox user to Linux class. Yeah, just for your emphasis right there, you're going to need these commands for your lab. You have your G flag sets the group ID for the new group. Your -R creates a system group for system services. There's way more flags to explore, right? Way too many for us to cover in this class. You can definitely click on this link to see more. If you want to see who's in your group, you can use the getEntGroup command. So getEntGroup, and then you give it the group name, will display users in a group. So for example, if we want to see who's in our sudoers group, very useful one, you do getEntGroup sudo, and it'll display the users in the group named sudo. Remember, sudo is that special group with special privileges, root level privileges. So output is structured as group name, :password, :group ID, :user list. So this group is called sudo. X, the password is hidden. That's what we use. So X or an asterisk, indicating that the password is stored in a more secure manner. A lot of times groups don't even have passwords. But yeah, sudo -x, X is the password. We can't see it. 27 is actually the ID for the sudo group. It's ID 27. Remember, for example, the root user has an ID, a user ID, right? This is group ID. Root user has a user ID of 0, whereas sudo has a group ID of 27. And then everything after this colon right here is just the actual users part of the sudo group. So user 1 and user 2 are part of the sudo group. Last but not least is the password command. So this updates or set the user's password. You pass it some options and some arguments. So we have the example, sudo password Joe changes the password of the user named Joe. So it's going to ask you, to provide that password afterwards. You can also delete a password with the -L. So it will lock the account if it doesn't have a password. You can just lock the account with the -L, which does the same thing. Um, lock a previously unlocked user account. And then we have -U, which unlocks a previously locked user account, and then -S, which actually show the status. So is it locked or unlocked? More password flags here if you click on the link. We're not going to use this one in the demo or the lab, but just there for your knowledge, for your convenience. Alright, so let's go ahead and finally step into this week's demo. I know it's a lot of different commands, a lot of new commands, but once we actually do the demo, everything will come together and make more sense. Of course, always make sure, right, to look through these slides, watch, and we could do it together, right, in the lecture video. I can go through the slides with you, and then watch the demo video. As long as you watch the playlist in order, you should be in good shape. Alright, so go ahead and click on to the next video to see that demo.